I'm gonna give you the short answer. It's fucking no. But let's just, you know.
Hey, Commanders. New players can start off with up to 123 free draws.
Shut the fuck up. Also, where's the balloon? Fucking balloon. Oh, shit. Thank God that's the only advertisement there was. Fucking balloon.
If you want to know if someone really understands evolution, just ask them this one weird question.
Why does poop smell bad?
Wow. Oh gosh.
Because there's bacteria in it, I guess.
Microbiome, probably. Trash
Yeah, trash
of
in
the
the gut.
body. The food we eat. Because of the chemicals.
Farts don't always smell bad. So.
Yeah, well, that's a different question entirely. Do you think it objectively smells bad?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
How do you think it smells to flies?
Like the.
They like it. They like it.
Yeah. Animals love stinky things.
Yeah.
They're attracted to it.
Poop smells good to flies because poop is full of nutrients. They use it as food. But it's also full of bacteria that can be life-threatening to humans. So the real
So let's start with the most basic thing of... Okay, so different creatures have different responses to different stimulus. So why is it like that for us? Well, must have some kind of benefit, right? Nothing wrong with that statement.
reason poop smelled bad to us is because if anyone ever thought it smelled good, they would probably get really sick, die, and not pass on their genes.
It's not that we ever thought it smelled good, it's that we didn't... There's an association of, well, how can we deal with it, and we just tolerate it because we only have limited solutions of stupid toilets that don't have plumbing because of the rate or the systems that are installed at the time. So, not exactly off to the best start, because most people, when, for example, in a jail cell, will simply shit in a corner. It's the best you can do at the time. But, I mean, let's just talk about species in general. Again, why does it smell? Well, that's because there's a negative association with everything to do with poop. Just like there are negative associations from the body, from the peanut allergies. It gives a reaction which is trying to tell you there's an intruder here. Usually it was a parasite. And now it's just a peanut because it has the same or similar shape on the molecular structure. So it's the body's way of telling us things are either okay or not okay based off of memory and prior experience.
After all, it's about survival of the fittest. But survival of the fittest what?
I mean, most people think of natural selection as being about the survival of the fittest individual animal.
Do you ever talk about trees in this video? The reason I ask is because I've already seen the video. He doesn't.
Individual.
Animal.
Okay, so it's like an individual.
Which makes sense. I mean, individuals best adapted to their environment have increased odds of survival and therefore a higher likelihood of passing on their genes. So it follows that each individual should do everything it can to survive and reproduce. That is, it should be selfish.
But if that's true, then how do you explain this?
I mean, worker bees will sting predators to protect the hive, even though it might kill them in the process. Female worker ants are sterile, so they can't reproduce. But regardless, they work for the colony for their entire lives until they die. Monkeys adopt orphans, wolves bring meat to non-hunting members of the pack, and squirrels can let out alarm calls to warn others about...
So this is examples of behavior, and unfortunately, if Derek is trying to say that behavior can be something genetic, I'm going to have to warn you, it's not. It just is not. There is nothing genetic about community. A single individual's behavior of, like, for example, where they might end up going... Look at homing pigeons. They specifically will not just go anywhere. They're capable of being attached to a location that basically the owner is able to choose. So their strong connection to that place is that it gives them the food, it gives them the security. So there's that, and that is something that is part of their connection to the individual that's keeping them. So it's a learned behavior. It's not something genetic, although it is genetics and predisposition of that type of behavior is in those types of homing pigeons versus others. It's still the way they are handled while they are developing that determines the rest of their behavior. So a lot of behavior with community, I feel, is more learned than genetically transferred. Although there's stuff like, there's a lot of interesting things about how, like, people might have all sorts of things about it. It's interesting to think that a body is making the instructions of what it basically can summarize about itself in the genetic patterns that are in the gametes or whatever, either the egg or the sperm, and that is passed on. So you end up with certain bits of instructions that talk about probably everything. But here's the thing. Eventually, he starts talking about how did I'll just go.
Nearby predators.
So if natural selection is all about selfish individuals, why do we observe so much altruism in nature?
The survival is of the species that can adapt.
I think generally the species.
Okay, so again, behaviors. If you were showed in the past, your mom is going to yell out, chances are there's some kind of communication method there, which is like, okay, I'm going to go watch, and you're going to listen, and if you don't listen, it's not really helpful for you, and if you do listen, you're going to survive. And then it's something where you know your mom protected you with their voice, you're going to do the same for your kids because you want them to survive. Because it worked for you. It's something you have a good memory of. This is something that is passed on. There's a lot of interesting personality traits that can go through genetics. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but certain bits of community, I feel, are things that are learned. Like, you can see this in individuals, specifically only a single individual, who is then brought over to a different community, and then they learn the social dynamics of that other community. They don't learn the ones that is indicative of their origins, their regular genetic profile. So like certain birds being around other birds, even though they're not of that species, act like the other birds that they grew up with, which is like freaking ostrich and chickens. The ostrich acts like a chicken to a degree, something like that. Again, social construct. Nothing to do with its genetics. It should not act like a chicken. It's not a chicken. It's a freaking ostrich. Or a peacock, for example, that doesn't do peacock things because it something.
For the survival of the species. So it's the survival of the species. Okay.
But survival of the fittest species or the fittest group also doesn't work. I mean, think about what you need for natural selection to occur.
You need something that replicates itself many times over, creating copies, and then you need a pruning process whereby some of those copies get eliminated and some thrive to go on and create more copies. The problem with groups or species as a whole is that they don't.
So someone who was cocky could end up trying to fight something that is way bigger than them, and then just end up getting smashed, and therefore their propensity to fight, unless they already made kids, is likely to not get passed down, you hope. And then you end up with less people who clearly just don't end up. But then there are species that will fight no matter what. You got freaking chihuahuas and whatever else and stuff, and it's like, oh, it's not really the best behavior, and somehow they're surviving. Like, how do you make sense out of that?
Don't typically make copies of themselves, so you almost never get copies of groups fighting other copies of groups to see which groups win out.
So if it's not survival,
the ape wars. Entire social hierarchy of two different entire massive groups of apes that control, what is it, Cambodia or whatever. It's like, one of them is on the north, one of them is on the south. There's all sorts of places that is like a neutral zone or the borderlands of where they are capable of roaming. And this is something that's like, it is heavily, do not mess with this. It is like within and between there's two separate cultures. It's like one of them was thinking, you know what, it's okay to be around humans. The other one was like, you know what, I'm going to be cautious, and for the sake of humanity, for the sake of my entire species, I'm thinking it's better we don't go near the humans because we don't know anything about them. They might be dangerous. So you got the one who are reckless and the other ones who are cautious, and they will go to war about it with their social structure, knowing all the different things, even for generations. It's crazy. So whatever you just said about groups not fighting other groups, I'm sorry, you know this story. You just said a blatant lie. Like, I'm sorry, what? Also, look at birds. You got some bird out there I heard of that's like so freaking greedy. Hey, you just fucked my mate? I'm gonna go in there and lick her clean so that freaking none of that stuff is in, and I'm gonna nut inside of her so that my genes get transferred. I don't even care if you fuck her, but like your genes, no. My genes, fucking yes. Okay, that's a social dynamic of like, yeah, you can freaking do stuff, but you're not allowed to make an egg with your shit in my girl. That's crazy. Okay, that's a real story. And I am like, you know that there are interconnected social networks which are like, oh no, you got freaking lions, hyenas, biggest story ever. You got this whole hierarchy or whatever else. In there, you have the dynamics between hyenas and males and females. You have tons of lions versus other lion prides and how they have their own area, and for the sake of genetic diversity they have their own specific area. Don't mess with the other group because maybe you're not worthy of it. And this is entire social dynamicism that is based off of, we're going to work together, and we're also going to make sure that the wrong stuff doesn't happen. What are you on, Derek?
Of the fittest individual, and it's not survival of the fittest group, then what is it? Well, to explain that, I want to take you on a little journey, all the way.
I don't need the journey. It is survival of. Let's put it this way. It's survival of me and my genes going forward, to which I have made no attempt whatsoever to try to proliferate. Ever. Because I don't see a candidate. Is that because conditions are not favorable? Because I'm freaking poor as shit. And also maybe I think my bloodline should stop. Even though I'm a fucking genius. Maybe I should make some kids so they can continue being smart and teaching people about rational thought. But that's the thing. It wasn't because I knew too much. I didn't know the strike that, reverse it. Great.
Back to the beginnings of the Earth.
This is where
we are now, there is nothing. Well, not really nothing, but nothing interesting. There are only simple things, like these blobs. This one might be a carbon dioxide molecule, or it might be cyanide. We don't know for sure what they are, but we do know that these compounds are very simple. So for now, they'll just be blobs floating around our void. In fact,
it could also be H2O. It has the three different... It could be any of those. Or it could be freaking gold with two other things. Who knows?
much of what we'll encounter along our journey here are just hypotheses. A lot of Earth's early history is still a mystery, so keep that in mind. Now, every so often, our globes get a surplus of energy, maybe from a ray of UV light or a nearby hot source. This is the first major upgrade to our void, excess energy, as it allows our blobs to interact with each other. And most of the time, this interaction leads to nothing. But sometimes these blobs can combine into more complicated compounds. Here's a simple simulated example where we only have 4 red blobs. Right now, they are all individual particles, but each time step we move forward, let's say there's a 10% chance that all 4 combine into one red mega.
Okay, so when it comes to individual atoms, we have this thing called electron hungry and other atoms. They want your free valence electrons and they grab them because they are, let's say, they have an amount of attractiveness that pulls in the other electron, and that makes the bond. So it's literally about, it is like, there's a lot of like, oh, it likes to hold things together. The more main thing is, again, you start adding gravity, and then you end up with a star, and in star you end up with compression, fusion, transformation from hydrogen and helium and carbon and iron and whatever on the way. And these things happen because stuff is moving around so much and there's so much pressure and whatever else that it has the ability to form these other basic elements. Then that crap explodes and you end up with a bunch of more complicated stuff out in the void, and then it fuses back together from the cloud into a solar system, for example. But other stars also had their own specific types of explosions which were more violent. They created the uranium and stuff because of the craziness that was that. And then they collapsed, they exploded again, probably. Our star is not a first, not even second, possibly a third star generation. It's not the first. So, again, you're talking about just random chance of things. These are very ordered and structured beginnings where, yeah, they're not doing anything genetic, but they're not out there doing nothing. They're making structures that are massive. So what I don't understand what he's talking about here.
Blob. Now imagine this megablob isn't very stable. For every time step it's alive, it has a 95% chance of falling apart back into the 4 smaller blobs.
Okay, so first of all, are you talking about the difference between hydrogen, helium, and that? First of all, like the beginning stuff and everything else, again, this is, when you're talking about nuclear physics and that type of stuff, it's remove the electrons, move all the parts around, and then they interact, and then they forge the new equilibrium. And electrons kind of just get pulled on in, and they get kind of locked where they are. They don't turn into anything less. There's no decay. There's none of this other stuff that he's talking about. The separating it again. They just are what they are in mass, constantly burning inside of a star or whatever else being emitted, and eventually when the star explodes, then the dust collects into things like asteroids and whatever else hitting and are in planets, and some of them all mixed together, blah 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 blah. You end up with freaking water on a planet that was molten hot at some point, and it's like, huh?
If we add more of these red blobs into the mix, you'll notice that they rarely ever come together. On average, a megablob only exists around 10% of the time. But if we were to reduce the chances of the megablobs dissolving to only 1%...
Okay, again, you're ignoring star formation, you're ignoring basic gravity, and stuff that actually happened in order to make things that are complex. What are you on about? Void interactions and that.
The void would suddenly be filled with them. This fact hints at an important law that governs our void, the law of stability. Unstable blobs fall apart and vanish, stable ones endure.
I'm sorry. Unstable meaning like carbon-14 or some bullshit? Or whichever one is the unstable one, it decays because of certain amounts of parts within inside of its. Where the fuck is the button?
Blobs fall apart and vanish. Stable ones endure.
Okay, so what if you're talking about maybe matter or antimatter? That has to do with the interactions between the positive parts and the negative parts. So antimatter naturally just has a limited amount of interactivity, and so they're unstable. And also, when they interact with regular matter, they explode. So the regular matter obviously wins because it gets pushed away by the explosion and does not, like, doesn't seriously end up staying, um, like it literally ends up making something bigger.
Now watch what happens if we speed this up dramatically. Maybe a couple of years per second, maybe even a couple million. You can see our blobs keep getting random jolts of energy, so they combine with others to form more complex compounds. Most attempts fail and fall apart, but every so often, by pure chance, you get a compound that is more stable than the blobs it's made of. This doesn't happen because...
Okay, so again, I gotta ask you something. What if you find that, like, what are the things that make it a molecule stable or unstable? Is all the different components that are holding it together. Certain ones, like water, are very stable. They tend to stay as water. They turn to ice and whatever else, so you end up with comets, other stuff, blah, 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 blah. And so all this stuff on a chemical basis and whatever else is like, we're ignoring base interactions, we're ignoring, again, gravity, we're ignoring we're not talking about how, like, in the early times there wasn't as much like they say the electrons weren't doing the thing yet. So you could have started with stuff that was protons, neutrons, and the electrons will come later. And so things are able to become more compressed. But I mean, whatever. This is a very vague and not very scientific, like, trying to set a narrative that ignores everything else that we already understand is kind of pointless to me.
The blobs want to build more complex structures, it's just because these new configurations happen to be more favorable in the environment. And now, when these complicated compounds become abundant enough, they too get a chance to combine, making our void increasingly complex. And one day, by accident, this causes an extremely unique shape to form, one with a special property. See,
so you're trying to say that genetics was made somehow first, and there are beings without genetics? So my question is this the rational thought? Like, at first, what would be the, like, people talk about the very most simple genetic bacteria and whatever else. You got a goddamn machine spinning a propeller with the flagella and whatever. So that bitch is complicated. And he's spinning around his little propeller, pushing around stuff. Freaking complicated as frick. Like, compared to that, moving like a leg or something, or just being like a snake or something, a worm, would be less complicated than a goddamn flagella. So, of course, the the idea of genetics popping up first is like the chicken or the egg. We're saying egg happened first. That, like, you have things that are like viruses. They technically are not alive. And the whole thing about that and everything. And it's like, what is the deal with viruses? They're basically sperm cells that are not normal at all. They're designed smartly to inject their DNA. But sperm are not that. Ironically, they are more hopeful that they can do the job. They're not actually like infiltrators. So, huh? If I was a species, wouldn't the virus type of genetic transfer be a better vehicle? Because you would definitely be able to say, well, we can just activate the genes that we want in a specific virus, and then the other viruses clearly would not make it because they can't. And it's like, that's not even how eggs and stuff do a thing. Because it's like a different method entirely. And all the virus really does is attempt to multiply its own self. So it's its own thing. It's its own perpetualness. And that is like a precursor. So, how does a virus happen? But instead, sperm becomes the thing that happens because it's, one, less violent, and like more gentle with the egg and everything, so that it, and the female component, the egg, accepts the sperm. But what's the difference between that and any other cell and what a virus does to it? Except for it's like the inverse of a mosquito, where the mosquito pulls out stuff, the virus pushes in stuff. And it's like, wait. Huh? So it's like, we don't even need to have proper, like, ideas of anything. We just go around and look for a cell, and then the virus just puts it in, and it's like, okay, make this thing. But then, here's a question for you. How does the substrate machine, like the RNA, these weird machines that can read, divide, cut, whatever else with DNA, they seem structured again. So that's a weird thing to say that it just comes out of, like, what? How does that even get made? This isn't addressed here.
Blobs it's made of just happen to attract similar blobs from the surrounding environment. This red blob always attracts green blobs, and this purple blob always attracts yellow ones. And piece by piece, all these blobs attract their opposites until their counterparts suddenly snap into position next to the original shape. Now, this shape goes on to do the same thing. Its green blobs attract red ones, and yellow ones attract...
In reality, we have a machine that has the DNA, and like the whole CRISPR thing, and it's an organic machine, and it just does this, where it separates the DNA into the two separate strands. Another one recombines them, and it's like, put these different parts out, and it's like, it's a whole, DNA and all of that junk is crazy, because it does not make any sense, because it doesn't, it's just a lot. And it's like, the person on a conscious level isn't controlling any of this. That's the fun part of it. None of this is being controlled by your actual, like, cognitive functions. You're not telling your genes, hey, make an eyeball somewhere, or whatever else. That just happens. And it's like all the genes that are separate, part of your gut biome and everything else, is another separate set of things. And it's like communities working on other communities. But the idea of it starting off and then just making this is like, it feels like it's ignoring like if the weirdest thing, okay, bananas without seeds. No genetics, they just, so the idea there is to just grow more of yourself. It's not to make offspring, it's to extend your own body. And so the cutting is like dislocated, and it wants to make more of its own self. Like a starfish. Reduce it down to just one limb, and it will remake the rest of the star limbs eventually. So you end up essentially cloning starfish. By separating the 5 different limbs, you end up with 5 separate starfish, possibly, depending on how much of the center you have per each, or whatever the hell that nonsense works with. But with banana trees and seedless bananas, it's nothing to do with genetics. It's everything to, or it's nothing to do with making an offspring. It has everything to do with just being more of yourself. So, like, there's this whole thing about trees, and trees are capable of having profiles that, like, a certain type of tree will make a chemical around them that will kill every other tree in the area, and it will be the only thing that is alive, and it is the only tree that can survive in that area. So that's the one that's like, oh yeah, you don't want to mess with this one. And then Other trees, like the ones that we have around, are like, yeah, let's work together instead, because that's fine. It's not going to be a problem mixing maple and pine and all of that stuff. But certain ones, like, what is it? Freaking mangrove or mahogany or whatever. I don't know. They're like, no, get away. I don't know which one it is, but it's like a tree will be like, fuck off. I don't want neighbors. I want all of the nutrients. I want all of the light. I don't want to be overcast. I'm like, I want to survive. Fuck you. And it's crazy that that can happen in just trees. There's also a weird thing that happens with like certain chemical reactions. You get certain metals in with other stuff, and you end up with this weird structure that Nile Red's made a few times. And it's like it grows. And that's just a chemical reaction. And it's not a biological process. It's just a structure that expands upward. And it's very fluffy and flaky and it doesn't really do anything. But if it could do anything, it would be it's just very similar to like organic ways of like, and it's interesting how like potato stalks and all of that will be attracted to light. And it's like, how do they know where the light is? The radiation. And it's like, well, it bounces around and so it follows the thing. And it's like, the more intense it is, the better it is and the more likely it will be to get out of the box and the maze. And it will just go up to the top, whatever the vine is. And it'll be at the top and it'll be like, yeah, now I have energy and I have the ability to thrive. Bare seed that will end up being forever on the outside of the box. Even though I'm stuck here forever. It's not like I can just pick up my stuff. I'm just a fucking potato.
Purple until another shape yet again snaps into position. This new shape looks exactly like the original. What just happened fully spontaneously is replication. One shape became two. This marks the birth of the first replicator.
Do you have any example of a type that can do this? Because again, you don't need any of this in biology. And similarly, like what I said to the amount of, there's some zinc oxide or whatever nonsense, just the idea of water and metal or something, an acid or whatever, was like, it makes this stuff that does these reactions and it pushes all the way away. And it's like, it's nutty and it's beautiful to look at, but it's not organic. And it's like, about that. Like, do you realize, like, the most simple organisms that don't need genetics, do they still even exist? Is there any way of having evidence of the basic things that could have existed? Is there any way of theorizing about the basic things that could have existed that, again, precede genetics? Because we're trying to say that it just happened and genetics has always and always will be the thing that was the start of everything. But I don't think that it was. That's the thing. I think that genetics is irrelevant to a blood cell. It just holds oxygen at some point. It just does its job. Or, you know, like a hair cell. certain parts that are conducive to the hair cell just construct the thing that is hair. And the purpose of it is weird and random, and it makes a structure, and it's not like making a root that then is going to get anything, or it's not making like a stem that's going to support anything. It's making a covering specifically to be perhaps less tasty to another being. So hair is like that, but it's also maybe making a covering to stop stuff like radiation from getting to a person's head, because the head being bombarded with radiation is not exactly healthy. So that's why we got hair on our head. It's the most needed of protection. Everywhere else can survive without it, so it doesn't make hair. Although it does, and we shave it, or I don't know, but I haven't needed to. But then there's other parts that's like, they have hair. And that's for ventilation and everything. I don't need to explain any of that. Pubes.
We don't know exactly what this replicator looked like. It might have been a single standalone molecule, or a group of molecules that worked together to replicate. There's a lot of debate on this today, so instead, let's represent the replicator as a character. How about this?
Immediately I went to the brain aneurysm of 3 blue 1 brown connection with the other guy, and he will reference the one that he's whatever, you get it.
This one here. Perfect. Keep in mind, it's still just a lifeless molecule, one without any intent or purpose.
It would be much better if you had like the structure of the presumed molecule above or inside, like wearing a shirt of that molecule. But like, let's just keep going with it. Or have it be somewhere like in the corner of the screen.
Now, you might think that the chances for the replicator to form were extremely unlikely. But in our void, where we have hundreds...
Again, I'll have to put this to you plainly. The weird thing about banana trees that have no seeds is that they don't need seeds. Because the stem just wants to make more, and then the fruit just is a byproduct of the rest of its expression. So although it is necessary to make all these different components, and there is ironically no variance capacity, there's no mixing, and there's no way of like making more. Look, it's ironic. We could always just go back and get the genetics and just say, oh, we'll just create the genetic components that are what would be in a banana seed, and then we'll just make more bananas eventually. Like literally any expression can just be reconstructed and then stimulated in the way that would cause a banana tree to grow. And then you have more extinct species that are able to come back because, duh, they're just parts. Put them together, let them go, and care for them, and they'll be fine. Nurturing and stuff. What are we on about in this video?
Of millions of years to play with, what might seem impossible to us becomes virtually inevitable. And the thing is, the replicator only has to arise once. Once it's here, it can take the simpler compounds available in the environment to copy itself at a much faster pace.
Okay, that's another thing. You talk about taking out parts. You have the ideas of cells and whatever else, but then you have like this sort of mitochondria or whatever else. And it's like, it was its own thing, and then it just became a subcomponent. And then blah, 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 blah. And the same thing happened and worked differently, but also plants and blah, blah, blah.
And so it does that until it entirely fills our void. At least that's what you'd expect. But there is a flaw in the process. At least that's what you'd expect. But there is a flaw in the process. See, during the Replicator's conquest of the Void, one of its copies makes a mistake. Perhaps a stray ray of UV light hits it during the replication process, or the Replicator uses a building block it wasn't supposed to. As a result, what we're left with is a new shape, which is slightly different from...
What is more likely is that instead of the normal building blocks that it would have made, like, for example, a carbon could have been replaced with something else, and that made an interaction that makes the entire set of things not be the same structure that it was before. So it makes mutation. All of the instructions are not exactly identical to the old instructions, so it makes something different because, duh, it's not the same instructions, so it won't make the same thing. Simply because of circumstance of what was around it at the time.
Its parent, and so its properties might be slightly different too. This error might be harmful. For example, it might make the copy less stable. It could be beneficial, making the copy better at replicating. Or it could be neutral, not changing the replicator in any meaningful way. This marks the final milestone in our void, mutation. Many species of replicators now occupy the void, and what they do is they replicate themselves.
Again, void. This whole idea of this as happening in empty space is, in my brain, not how it happened at all. We had an atmosphere first, or something. And also, it's interesting that there could have been a pre-civilization, like an alternate, like before our star reformatted itself into a star in the solar system, it was something else. That something else also exploded. So, all of the stuff that it could have had, like we end up thinking about our place in the universe being millions of years old, but the universe being billions. So, there's a chance of things like tardigrades and whatever else that could have been developed in a previous generation star planetary system, which we have no evidence of any idea what it could be like. And then you have that thing surviving the trip all the way back to Earth, and you end up with that going around doing its thing. But then you have other species on this planet, and it's like, is it really only tardigrades that are capable of surviving through space and everything and stuff, or is it genetics and stuff that are capable of handling that transition? That's a whole other ball of wax. But again, all this didn't happen in space. It happened in an atmosphere. It happened somewhere. The beginnings where they started taking certain things that were in the planet and then utilizing that for energy, and then that made a byproduct, and then that made other things and stuff. And are you talking about any of that? No.
The problem is they all need the same limited resources, and so our void...
No. They need whatever works for them. Other organisms need completely different resources. For example, the carbon dioxide that everyone else was like, I don't want this anymore, was needed by the new things called plants which then use it to make oxygen. Yeah, freaking algae and simple stuff where it's like, oh, let's make all these different components and then it all blah 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 blah.
It turns into a battleground. So which replicator will win? What kind of properties will the void favor? Well, let's try to simulate what happens.
I just want to reiterate, it was never the void where any of this got started. I don't care about your... I'm sorry.
What a replicator battle might look like, let's assign simplified traits to each of the replicators. Starting with the first one. This replicator is special, since it's the only one that can form spontaneously from smaller building blocks. So we'll give it a spawn rate. This should be quite rare, so let's set the chance of formation to 1% per time step. Just keep in mind we're just making these numbers up. The simulation is purely illustrative. Now, once the replicator spawns, let's say it's governed by 3 key traits. First, a death rate, the chance of it falling apart or being destroyed with each time step. Let's set that to be, say, 2%. Second, a replication rate, the chance to copy itself with each time step, let's say 4%. And finally, a mutation rate, the chance a copy comes out mutated. If it's 4%, roughly 1 in 25 copies will be a mutation. So every time a new mutation spawns, it will inherit the replication, death, and mutation stats from its parent, but slightly randomized. Notice that we won't give any of these secondary replicators a spawn rate. They'll only be able to form as mutations from previous generations. So if all of their copies die out, they'll be gone for good. Now before we run the simulation, I want to quickly...
There you are, Primer, love you. Fucking adorable and very informative and everything, and it's very, like, this...
Shout out the YouTube channel Primer. Our setup was inspired by his amazing in-depth simulations on evolutionary biology. You should really check him out. Okay, let's run it. The graph on the right will show how the populations grow, and this box on the left will show a slice of the void with all the winning replicators in the correct ratios. You can see how the first...
Son of a bitch.
You can see how the first replicator appears and then immediately disappears, because it just happened to die before it got the chance to replicate. But
okay, so here's the thing about that. Again, there's this whole thing about how all sorts of stuff can happen without organic processes. So, ironically, the type of stuff that can make... It's like freaking coral, dude. Coral is such a crazy thing, and it would seem to be an inorganic process, but it's alive. And it's nutty. And it's like...
That's okay. The original replicator can be created from smaller blobs, so it'll come back at some point. This time, it's starting to take off. You can also see that it spawns some mutations, but they're struggling to keep up. Eventually, though, superior mutations pop up and start to replicate faster than the original. But you can see almost all of them are growing exponentially, which is unrealistic. That's because we're missing the final piece of our simulation, limited resources. The building blocks should eventually run out. We can simulate this effect by
I don't disagree. I mean, the amount of limited resource would be per entire biome. I mean, you look at rainforest, they got tons of stuff all jam-packed into one thing, where you got freaking Australia.
Introducing a sort of resource factor to each species' replication rate. This factor should depend on the total number of replicators in the void, n, which will also divide with an arbitrary crowding factor, c. C lets us define the maximum number of replicators we'll allow into the void. Say C is 10,000, then once there are 10,000 replicators, the two terms cancel out and drive the replication rate down to 0, meaning none of the replicators will be able to make copies until the population drops again. So let's see how this...
I would say that it doesn't make it 0. It makes it so that there's overpopulation, and then you have stuff on top of other stuff, and then they could do that thing where we're like, oh, well, you know what? There's not enough space for all of us. Why don't we work together and use our resources because mitochondria just took over a cell and whatever else and did like we know happened.
Changes our simulation. Okay, like the last time, the original replicator starts to grow, after which it's quickly taken over by its mutations. But this time, most of these mutation populations start to decline. Because of the scarce resources,
I'm sorry, you got this massive number, you call that a decline. Good analysis.
New best population, the Lyme one, actually starts stealing resources from the others. After that, a few more mutations pop up, even more powerful than the Lyme. Ultimately, the purple replicator takes over, occupying around 9,000 of the 10,000 available spaces. It completely curbs all the other populations. It goes without saying that the environment plays a massive role in which replicator wins.
And then you have how many things happening in a species and a community and like the whole environment that is like, okay, we will make this other thing work, and then the other thing makes our thing work. So like you could have interactions with trees or whatever else, like how whatever will continue to maybe plant the other seeds because if that's how they do, like they hide them somewhere and it's like instead of coming back to it, it ends up growing because that's what seeds do. And it's like, oh, I'll keep it around maybe for a bit. Where it's like you would really want to hide stuff in a place where it wouldn't grow, unless of course you want more of that thing to grow. Then you're like, oh, I'll just make more of this. Plant it here, plant it there, and then make, chances are later on more things will be around and then there will be more houses for people because they just happen to grow the stuff that I usually just eat by the hundreds. So it's like it would make sense that I would want more of that thing so that I can have my kids can then also have more so that they can eat as well, and a growing number of that in all regards.
If you change the environment, you likely change the outcome. But let's look at the stats of the replicator that came out on top this time. That winning species has a replication rate of 20% compared to the 17% average across all populations. Obviously, being able to replicate quickly pays off here. Its death rate is below average. Replicators that fall apart less quickly can make more copies. And finally, it has a 1% mutation rate, compared to the average of 3.73%. Although mutations help by injecting diversity, for any single species, fewer mutations mean more faithful copies. If we rerun the simulation, you'll notice the outcomes are always slightly different. But the winning species consistently have high replication and low death and mutation rates.
Oh my god.
Replication and low death and mutation rates. Now, in the real void, things wouldn't have been as simple. Instead of just tweaking these three stats, the replicators would have to mutate all sorts of different ways to gain an advantage. For example, one replicator might mutate a trait that lets it destroy other individuals, and then use their building blocks to make more copies of itself. This looks like strategy, but it's really just chemistry that gets copied over and over because it helps the replicator survive. Naturally, a risk of offense would likely favor mutations that result in defense.
So the interesting thing is, why would a species even want to proliferate at all? You would think that they would want to exist and then they would be done and that would be it. And if another person exists, they would have to compete for them. So fully selfish clearly could be a thing. But here's the thing. It usually isn't that way, that there is like fish who will totally transform their body so that they can become the new mate, so that they can then help for the continuation of the species. So it's like,
So an opposing replicator might stumble upon a mutation that helps it form protective barriers from nearby materials, letting it endure those attacks. These barriers would
either a smell or skin.
Also help protect the fragile replicators from environmental damage like you.
Or like spikes or color shade difference.
UV light. This marks an important threshold. The replicator's traits aren't limited to just determining the properties of the molecules themselves. They can also shape the environment. So by chance, the replicators inevitably mutate in ways that build scaffolding around themselves to increase the chances of their survival. They stumble upon ways of making structures to propel themselves around. They develop senses and ways of storing energy. They even mix, exchange, and steal traits from each other. Through billions of years of trial and error, this scaffolding gets more and more complex, and as a result, the replicator's interactions with the void become exceedingly indirect. They build complex survival machines for themselves, machines whose sole purpose is to protect the replicators inside. These machines became such experts at surviving, they're still around some 4 billion years later. They are the bacteria, plants, fungi, and animals all around you. Everything alive,
or it's the skin cells,
including you, was built as a survival vessel for these replicators. But today, you'd barely recognize them as replicators. Now, we just call them genes.
Yeah, sure.
They're hidden deep within every living creature. Strands of DNA made from the sequences of A, T, G, and C nucleotides. Now, one of the leading theories is that those earliest replicators were actually something closer to RNA molecules. But then over time, this must have evolved into a more stable system of storing information, the DNA and proteins we use today. They are the code that shapes our traits. We're taught that these traits are here solely...
The thing about DNA versus RNA is it's just the fact that when you have the secondary part that holds the outside, it's like you have the code, right? And you have this whole ladder, but then those can have interactions, and instead you can have a stabilization system where one half of the DNA is essentially instructions to make sure that when the other half of the DNA comes back, it is rebind with the correct information. Unless, of course, something gets weirdly zippered, and then you end up with incorrect parts in different places. Blah, 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 blah.
To help ensure our survival, the survival of the individual or the species. But do we have this the wrong way around?
When you have a child, what do you pass on?
The DNA. The genes. Okay, yeah.
These tiny replicators are still fighting the same battle that started billions of years ago.
You also have the community.
And the logic behind them hasn't changed. The traits just become more convoluted. Replicators that produce traits poorly suited to their environment tend to become less common, while those that produce advantageous traits become more numerous in the population. So it's not about the fittest individual or group, it's fundamentally about the survival of the fittest genes. They are the core unit of natural selection. But why would natural selection care exactly for the gene? Why not something smaller or something?
The other thing is, again, like, it's interesting that when you have things like a giant fish that literally, like the sunfish, they say it's a very stupid fish, and it'll just be there on the surface, and it'll be like, hey, you know what? Maybe these things that are on my body might be something that someone else can eat. So, like, the birds come over and eat it, and we just wait for anyone else to come over and eat it. And so they get all these little snacks, which are just irritating me, and then, you know, I just like go around being protected by everyone. And I'm like a all you can eat buffet over here. So it's like, you don't want to eat me, you just want to eat the stuff that hangs around on me. And that means that the other thing about the stuff that hangs out around me and the stuff that is me is like, maybe that's not what you want to eat. Also, hanging around all those other creatures is making it more likely that maybe they'll protect, but they can't protect from like certain creatures that just bounce you around like you're a tennis ball or something.
Think bigger.
Yeah, fuck's sakes.
Or something bigger. Well, for something to undergo selection, it needs to have three characteristics. First, it needs to be able to make near identical copies of itself. Second, it needs to exhibit traits that affect its interaction with the environment, which third affect the probability of survival and reproduction of the replicator. Something small, like a single nucleotide, doesn't work, because sure, it'll make identical copies of itself, but alone it doesn't exhibit a trait that could be selected for. What about something bigger, like a chromosome? Well, each chromosome affects potentially thousands of traits that could influence its survival, but when most creatures reproduce, sections of chromosomes get swapped around. So a chromosome doesn't stay together as a cohesive replicating unit, and therefore it can't be selected for. But a gene is somewhere in the middle. It's a long enough stretch of DNA that it can independently influence a trait, but it's also short and stable enough to be faithfully copied over into future generations. This is why the gene is the unit of natural selection. This perspective led to one of the most powerful and controversial ways of seeing evolution, one popularized by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. Based on the work of evolutionary biologists in the 1960s and 70s, and as a response against the then very popular group selection theory, Dawkins argued that just about every trait, from animals helping each other to being completely selfish, is a strategy that helps their genes survive and replicate. Genes that maximize their own survival are the genes that propagate best, even if they do so at the expense of others. Or in Dawkins' words, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. Now, you might think this framework isn't all that groundbreaking. I mean, take the emperor penguins in Antarctica, for example. They hesitate to jump into the water until they are sure there are no seals around. So what kind of genes could help a penguin survive in this environment? Well, if the penguin's set of genes make it more like...
Again, community versus... Look. If you got like all sorts of penguins around you, they pretty much sound similar, just like humans seem to sound similar. But when you call out for your mom and your mom calls out for you, you know what they sound like. So when you got penguins and they call out for the mother and there's a freaking blizzard going on and they can tell each other apart, you know there's community going on. There's some kind of connection, and it happens on a communicative level, which means all sorts of stuff having to do with logic parts of the brain are happening there. And it's something that's learned because you grew up with it. Because if you didn't, you wouldn't have grown up. So that is a thing that is an observed and understood because, yeah, caution just makes more sense. And then you would learn that from your parents. There's stuff like where salmon migrate to and how they started in one place where it made sense, and it's this memory from the past of what all worked for them, and then that's what will probably work for their kids because that's what happened. So they start there and they go back to where they started so that maybe the next ones can have the best start. Otherwise, it's probably not going to work out very well. You start somewhere else and it might not be good conditions. So there's this whole thing about retaining information over time and then attempting to recreate the best conditions of survival for everyone involved. And this is found, again, as a part of community. It's not just a part of, or it's a part of, again, memory and what happened with, for example, your own parents and things. Even if you don't know your parents, you knew how things started. You knew how things began for you. Maybe you know about different areas that it's like, this is not best for the sake of, example, eggs or whatever else, because you notice things eating the eggs or whatever else. Blah, 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 blah. Not genetics. Learning. Totally separate, possibly. Is it possible that a salmon who has a genetic step that starts somewhere simple, like in someone's pond, and then you go try and put them where they naturally would from then on exist, is that just it? Are they going to ever come back to that pond? The chances are extremely zero. So will they ever be able to make a kid? Because will they ever be able to find conditions that are similar to that pond or something? It's like, chances are they're not. So that's not great.
To be timid, the penguin might stay back until someone braver tests the water. That way the penguin is at a lower risk of being eaten and has a better chance of surviving, reproducing, and passing on its timid genes. Here, you can think about this either as the timid genes help the penguin, or the penguin helps the timid genes. Either way works.
So is there any real benefit to viewing things from the gene's perspective? Well, look at what happens when you use these two frameworks to explain altruistic behavior, which appears in a lot of places in nature.
Take California ground squirrels, for example. Females will let out alarm calls if they spot a predator, like a fox or a hawk,
This is another example of just something that was, oh, yeah, my parents did this for me. I'm going to do this for my kids. I'm sorry, how is this a genetics thing? This is a community thing. Denying communities is like denying the quote-unquote sentience of animals, which, at whatever variation, we got crows who are smart as kids or whatever. So all of these creatures might be as smart as a couple-year-olds, and they're just doing the best that they can or whatever. Or they might even be more advanced. It's crazy.
Warn other nearby squirrels, even though this puts her survival at risk. The genes influencing this behavior surely don't help this squirrel. But can the squirrel still help the genes?
I think this is a bit more clear if you think about the fact that most living things reproduce sexually.
Right.
Ugh. What am I looking at? Oh, it's a Pokemon again.
Half its DNA from its mom and half from its dad, so it's actually sharing half its genes with each parent. But also, any child that it has, it's also going to share half of its genes with the child, but also any siblings. But then if you take a step out to an uncle or up to a grandparent, then it's sharing 1/4, and then another step out is 1/8. All to say, you share a lot of genes with your immediate family. And California ground squirrels, females in particular, they live around family.
So if a squirrel has a set of genes that make her call out when she spots a predator, there is a very good chance that the squirrels that hear her warning call also carry those genes. Now, as a result of her alarm call, let's say the squirrel attracts...
It's a lot more likely to say that what if at some point it happened that someone was like, oh shit, there's a predator, and you all just ran the fuck away. And then we were like, you know what? What if I actually call out, and if I have the ability to survive, perhaps, maybe the other people will run away and have a chance. Because, like, we can't all make it, but maybe they can.
Predator her way and it ends up getting eaten. This action cost the call genes the chance to pass themselves on to any future offspring in that squirrel. But if the warning call saved at least 2 copies of those genes in 2 of the squirrel's relatives, well then in total these 2 squirrels have a better chance of passing on the genes through.
Are you seriously going to ignore the chance of it being a memory, community, learned trait, whatsoever? And just say, no, genes, yeah, doesn't.
Their offspring than that single squirrel did. From the gene's perspective, this could be a good trade-off. It doesn't matter which individual helps the genes replicate, only that as many copies as possible survive. This principle, that altruistically helping your close relatives helps preserve your own genes, is known as kin selection. And the payoff behind...
I would rather hear about meerkats and their whole system, because holy crap, that's a crazy system. It's similar, but quick before the hyena comes.
Any altruistic gesture under kin selection depends heavily on how related you are to the individuals you're helping. Because the less related you are, the smaller the chances that you will share that particular gene with another individual. And you can see this in nature. Male squirrels that don't live near relatives almost never give out warning calls. Now, there is a big question this gene...
Wait. Bitch just said person isolated, no community, doesn't do the thing his genetics would say otherwise to do. I'm sorry, did you just say someone who doesn't have the community doesn't exert the behavior? Oh my god, this is why group theory is a thing and you're just ignoring it.
View still has to address.
I need to hear that again, because fuck you.
Own genes is known as kin selection. And the payoff behind any altruistic gesture under kin selection depends heavily on how related you are to the individuals you're helping. Because the less related you are, the smaller the chance...
The birds literally taking the stuff out of the other birds, so it's like, nope, you're not making a kid. And then, I'm making a kid with this chick. You know?
Is that you will share that particular gene with another individual. And you can see this in nature. Male squirrels that don't live near relatives almost never give out warning calls.
Again, that shows community. So, if you're not near anyone that you're trying to protect, why the fuck would you call out? You're not trying to protect them. Right? So, it's kind of like we're trying to, you know, make sure that we survive. So being stealthy is fine when you're just alone doing your own thing. And when you're caring and nurturing for a group, it makes sense that you'd want to alert the rest of the danger. That's a community thing. That's not a genetics thing. I don't understand how you missed that.
Now, there is a big question this gene-centric view still has to address. If selection really favors genes that replicate well, then why would sex ever evolve as a means of replication if it throws away roughly half the genes?
Most animals reproduce sexually, so why do it when some organisms, like certain plants and fungi, get to pass on all of their genes through asexual reproduction?
Well, the thing about it is, yeah, I talked about the bananas that don't even freaking do sex and whatever else. Oh, they could. They just don't realize that they're not doing it because that part of the thing isn't making seeds and to do the stuff. The fascinating part about all of that is because, well, one of the things that is noticed, not because of, but because one of the things that is noticed is that when you have genetic diversity, stuff like a freaking blight won't kill off all of you. It'll just kill off the ones that have the genetic stuff that blah 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 blah, and the parts in that person reacting to the parts in that blight. But the rest of the ones, it's just like the apes war. The apes that are okay with the humans possibly are going to get hurt because they're gullible idiots. And that's so the other apes who are not gullible idiots are going to be like, yeah, I'm keeping away from that. We're just going to keep surviving over here. Don't try to convince us to go over there. That's not safe. And it's a whole thing where, the danger is less likely to happen because we have diversified. Keeping all your eggs in one basket is just a bad idea. Just flat out dumb. So, by mixing it up, you end up hoping that your next generation is going to have stuff that can handle stuff better than how you handled it. So, you might not get a disease as easily. You might not get killed by predators as easily or whatever else because maybe you're taller or shorter, depending on which is the better scenario for you and whatever else. Or just be random because random also means like blood type stuff and whatever else can be all over the place and do their things. And some people could be just immune to all sorts of stuff. Some people could be carriers. And it's not great when they come in contact with other people who can get the thing, but it's great when those ones are able to then exist and keep existing so that someone is existing.
From a gene's perspective, this seems like a much better deal.
When it comes to sexual reproduction, people like to say, okay, well, it mixes up the genes. It's like shuffling a deck of cards. And isn't that better for creating more variation? And clearly, that's advantageous.
Another way this has been explained is if the genes that regulate sexual reproduction benefit from replicating sexually, then they're going to keep pushing for these genes.
Right.
Even if it's a net negative to all the other genes in the genome.
Yeah.
Genome.
Yeah.
So if it benefits them, they'll keep pushing for it.
So are there any problems with how the selfish gene explains natural selection? Well, yes. I mean, it turns out the framework comes with a lot of controversy.
Uh-huh.
One of the biggest criticisms against the selfish gene is that it leaves little to chance. It implies that every gene present in the genome is there because it actively got selected for by natural selection over many generations. But many genes are actually invisible to natural selection because they don't really exhibit meaningful traits in the population.
Yeah.
Yet they can still
Red hair,
evolve
whatever.
over time. Imagine 20 blind cave fish, 10 with green eyes and 10 with blue. Since they're blind, we'll assume that their eye color traits make no difference to their survival, so they get passed down purely by chance. Now, to form the next generation, randomly pick any fish from the first group.
Now, here's the thing. What would really happen is that they would mix her and whatever, and you would have the potential of them having the genetics being either active or inactive, or present and not present at all. And so there are some genetic stuff where it's like, oh, well, the next generation might end up getting those parts turned on because that's how that works. And it might be like a hidden thing that might express itself later. But there's also the chance that it could develop the thing that is then instead like a whole new idea, like randomly getting purple eyes or some nonsense. Purple is very, like, I've never seen that, heard of it, whatever. Unless you're talking about frogs or some shit. I doubt purple eyes exist, but I mean, they got to somewhere, probably. And so it's about all the stuff that can lead to that happening and whatever. And again, that genetic expression could stay on all the time because they're always in that environment. There's no reason to change that. There's nothing else that would like, there's no other components that would take in the components that then change the color of the eye. It's always the same stuff, so it always constructs the same way. So, and this is annoying because stuff like copper poisoning or whatever else can make your eyes have different color, sort of, not exactly, but whatever. And so there's these weird things about, oh, you have different stuff and whatever. It's more like you got infected by something metallic or whatever, and you're scarred, and you're not expressing the way your genetics actually express, but you're expressing how your environment forces you to express. Or you could be albino, I don't know.
And replicate it. If you repeat this 20 times, you get a second generation. By chance alone, one color will probably appear more often than the other, and if you repeat this process over and over many generations, one color might eventually completely take over.
Again, the idea that they wouldn't mate because they could possibly intermingle, there's this whole idea that you could have the genetics be on and hidden and off in the next generation and then on again in the following. So there's this like flopping back and forth, seeing what works and whatever else. And again, without the idea of intermingling, you're missing some of the point or whatever. But of course, you mentioned it earlier, so whatever, maybe you do understand. But then why don't you mention it here? It's weird.
That's not because it's better, but purely due to random sampling. This shift in the frequency of gene variants is called genetic drift. It's most apparent in small populations and for...
It's like those island finches that, because of how they are in that island, they end up developing from the birds that came off from the mainland. And so you end up with genetic expression that is indicative to the environment that is like a whole other supposed wink wink species, but it's not species. Again, it's like copper poisoning in your eye. It's a different thing where it's environmental expression, not genetic expression, if that makes any sense. Like, If your environment just constantly takes off your middle finger or something, you're going to only have 4 fingers if you include the thumb. And so you're not going to express that you ever had 5. But you could have that as your genetics, but your environment just screws you all the time. And why would it do that? Well, something about something, blood flow, the limb just goes away, and then you don't even think about it because you've always known yourself to be a 4-limbed creature. Blah, blah, blah. And, who cares?
Traits that aren't pruned by natural selection. But it doesn't only apply to silent genes. Even when genes exhibit meaningful traits, there is a chance that genetic drift overrides natural selection and a less fit gene will spread through the population just by chance. Look back at our replicator battle. If we run our simulation enough times, sometimes the winning gene won't be the one with traits that maximize its own survival. Here, you can see that the winning population actually has a higher than average mutation rate, just by chance, and the average mutation rate is also higher than the starting value. These are simplified examples, but there is an ongoing argument about how much of evolution was actually due to natural selection and how much of it was up to chance. Another major criticism of the selfish gene is about the unavoidable implication behind the word selfish. It seems to imply that genes have agency, like they know what they're doing and they understand the consequences, but it's only a metaphor, just as portraying them as characters was a way for us to make the story more engaging.
Again, your genetics has nothing to do with you and your choices and everything else, but it has to do with your body expressing what it understands about you at that time in genetics that then can be transferred to the next generation. So like if your dad knew about a bunch of different things and then ended up developing a relationship and they had you would have that information and skills and whatever else. But if he then went to the war or whatever else and came back and ended up making another kid, it's possible that the war information and all of that could have been transferred, and it's nothing to do with you, it has everything to do with the stuff that all happened to that person's body and whatever else. And also, what if they randomly got parasites? Then you have the peanut allergy suddenly because they were stupid and they had not cooked their food, so they ended up with parasites, so they ended up with you having peanut allergy. I'm not saying that's how that works. I don't know how that works, but it's something, blah, blah, blah. Plausible and crazy. And it's a lot. So, it would be possible that the same person now with the new gene expression makes a child with someone that has a completely different function inside of them, other than whatever the hell it is that you are and you had. Or similarly, like if they just made love to someone else who has a completely different set of genetic expressions, then the other half obviously mixes differently, so you end up with a sibling who's the brother from another mother nonsense. Or obvious, like it just happens that way. So you're connected only half much, and the other half is like everything that's different about you guys. And even twins can be different and whatever else. It's crazy.
Of course, molecules don't know what they're doing. They don't decide to replicate or conspire to outcompete others. They just react according to the laws of physics. So what may look like intention is just simple chemistry that happens to work well, and
it's like the inorganic compounds of metal versus acid, and then oxidation and structure and whatever, and it's nothing to do with anything, but it's everything to do with it's just how the compounds develop.
Propagates. But perhaps the most obvious and easiest to understand criticism is that the whole framework is an oversimplification.
Doctor.
Understand criticism is that the whole framework is an oversimplification. And that's true. Genes are much more complicated than we thought. It's not as simple as one gene equals one trait.
Yeah.
One gene can influence many traits, and one trait can be influenced by many genes. There are genes that are wholly contained within other genes. There are genes that inhibit or activate others, and then there are even genes that seem to not encode for anything.
Like the stuff that can control for the size and shape of the eye and whatever else, versus the other stuff, which is like the types of cones that are in that eye, or the types of stuff that makes the color of your eye, can be a completely different set of things that blah blah blah.
So-called non-coding DNA. All to say, we still have a lot to learn about genes. Not to mention that the environment itself, like whether it's hot or cold or how much food there is, also affects how different genes get
or community
expressed. Genes are much less deterministic than they might seem. So you might think that a single gene would rarely have a large enough effect that natural selection can directly impact it. But it doesn't matter how convoluted the pathway is. If a gene has a measurable effect on its own survival and replication, it will be subject to some amount of natural selection. And surely the whole theory is a simplification, but any theory or framework of nature is. And what we're covering in this video is an even more simplified picture of that framework. But that doesn't take away the fact that viewing the world through this lens has an incredible power to help us understand the process of evolution. It helps us understand why we see such a range of different behaviors in our world, because fundamentally those traits tend to cause the increasing prevalence of the genes they're associated.
Jellyfish are the craziest freaking things because apparently they don't even have brains, question mark?
With. It's like the whole point is figure out what
spiders' telescope eyes are crazy cool.
It's true. Like, get to the truth. And this, to me, is the baseline truth of evolution. Is what I love about Making Veritasium is that we get to sort of unpack and dig under the hood. And it's what I loved about reading
ignoring certain
the Self-Gene book. So it really opened my eyes to this, previously I was just probably thought at the level of the individual. But it makes more sense to think at the level of the gene. The feeling that you and every other living organism is being driven by some molecules deep in every cell is fundamentally unsettling. And
the ramifications of everything was determined by genes was considered to be completely false when you consider criminals. Because it doesn't matter if you're born from someone who is supposed to, hoping to keep the peace or whatever, or someone who's already doing violence or crime, you can develop the traits of keeping the peace or violence or crime independently. And that has to do with your own sensibilities and your environment and maybe your genetics, but not really. There's no way genetics is part of what makes people criminals, although it may make them more likely, possibly. There's no excuse. It's much more likely that it's community, it's learned, it's developed, and when behaviors are left allowed to develop on their own without checks and balances, or with the improper checks that push them into the opposite direction of what is the best, then it's more likely that the wrong things end up being developed, or things that are problematic to everyone else.
To remove agency from you as a acting, thinking being in the world.
Yeah, it's pretty grim, but whether or not you agree with the fact that we might be controlled by our genes and we're simply their flesh robots,
right?
I think it's kind of unreasonable and unrealistic to go through life thinking that every decision is governed by this. It doesn't really do you any good because we perceive the world as individuals. So I think it's very beneficial to see yourself as your own thing, as your own, unit.
Again, you're trying to say, oh, maybe we bundle ourselves, maybe we don't, maybe community has nothing to do with how we develop, and it has everything to do with how we develop. There's entire reasons why tribes have their own communities and have the understanding of what they know works for them, and they don't interact the same way with outsiders, and it's a totally different feeling, it's a totally different thing. And it's like freaking people in the Bronx versus people in Britain, or people in Paris, or people in Japan versus people in just the Shire. I don't know. Environmental stuff and community is a major thing that makes our brains have those checks and balances, and without it, you end up with abnormalities and logics that are not correct. This is why enablers are bad with a lot of things. If you enable people to think it's okay to be bad towards people who make mistakes, then you end up with encouraging bullying, because your first idea is that, well, we don't want mistakes, but the problem is you're encouraging bullying. You're not discouraging mistakes. You're not encouraging good choices. You're actually just pushing people around and hoping good choices end up happening. That's not okay. And enablers, I've found in communities, are the ones who are like, oh, well, I'm a toxic friend, and I think that whatever you want and whatever something, and if someone says something about you and whatever, that's like, don't bother with them because they just don't care about you and stuff. And people are like, oh, do we like laws or do we hate laws? Honey, you like traffic laws, because otherwise people would just run you the fuck over because you're crossing the road in the middle of the road, and they don't have to care about you doing that because you're supposed to cross in the crosswalk, not in the middle of the road. But there's an understanding that they can happen. So we have ways of like knowing when people might cross and be cautious about that. Be ready to put on your brakes and all of that. Don't just keep moving. And being thoughtful about others is highly important, yeah. Again, trying to say It's one thing to be fascinated and happy about all the different parts that you've expressed in this video, but it's another thing to say that we're going to ignore the idea of community. We're going to ignore the idea of people communicating to each other to make certain understandings that are then either learned from observation or by direct teaching from one parent to their children, and stuff like freaking apes and all that with their community is crazy huge. It's not something that's just like left to chance or whatever else. It's not genetic expression. It's a goddamn mom saying to the kid, hey, do this, do that, and they do it, or they don't, or whatever. And stuff gets passed on. There's entire names for each whale that they say to each other. It's like, hey, Greg, and all of that. They know each other's goddamn like name, and they have dialect. Like people who are like whales from different areas of the globe have different enunciations of their utterances that make for a different word set. That is like, oh, the most lonely whale, because they speak on a range that is totally different than everyone else. It's like a language that's like freaking Japanese versus English. You don't quite get it. And, or it's like having to talk to ants when you're giant. You can't hear it, or whatever else. But the freaking, there's entire viruses and whatever else and bacteria and parasites that can take over creatures like freaking fungus and whatever else, taking over ants or stuff growing inside of a bug. And it's like it makes it go over and do things that it normally would never do. And it's like, dude, we're getting hijackers up in here. A freaking fungus knowing how to control a greater being like an ant. Like, in a rudimentary way. Freaking Pickle Rick up in here. But for real. And then the cycle continues. This is coordination on a vast scale. It just feels insane to think that you could miss out on all those different amazing components. And it's like you wouldn't put everything, like he said, it's a simplification or whatever else. But there's no reason to ignore certain basic components. You can already say all these different things and then not just deny it or ignore or not mention that certain parts are part of how it is, because you think of just genes and it's like it's like a question. But it's not a question. It's like they're trying to make a statement. But that's not how it is. It becomes then a false statement, and it becomes like, even if it's only a simplified version, if it doesn't explain everything, and maybe you in other videos talk about the rest of the subject. But you could still say, like, community is part. Maybe in roundabout ways you do. And I'm hovering over this whole thing as if it's something to be worth being bothered about. But science communication matters so freaking much to me that it's like, okay, maybe I'll try to understand things. This whole idea of evolution and everything else like that. This concept of we start with the genetic components and then they end up making a thing and then life ends up being developed. It's like what is it not possible to make something that can reproduce or whatever, proliferate, without it being genetic? Like, a more simple thing and again, I mentioned stuff like inorganic compounds and bits of like metals and oxygen making those weird tree-like structures. But, I mean, it's all flaky and everything. But imagine you have that kind of stuff happening inside of like certain other substances that end up making it like take up space other than what would be there. And then those structures get utilized by stuff or whatever. I don't know. The thing about it all is the hypothesis about stuff that doesn't use genes is like, and again, there's stuff like our gut biome and whatever else, and it's not part of our own genetics. It's an entire separate species that is coincide with us, that because of our past and what was in the mom ends up going into the baby. And so there's all of this stuff that is alive and whatever else. And it's like it's making a new thing that is designed to help the gut biome exist. So are the gut biome calling the shots? And it's like, I don't think so. But it's like a whole ecosystem. Whatever.
I want to give a big shout out to Joe Hansen from Be Smart for helping us out with this video, and another shout out to Primer for letting us adapt his simulation on the first replicators. I have put links to...
Yeah, glad that you actually had not just inspiration, but permission to use that kind of likeness and blah, 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 blah. Who cares? But, I mean, in the end, I don't actually care. But it's like, yeah, I'm glad you had that collaboration. That was cool.
Their channels down in the description, so please check them out. And finally, I want to say a huge shout out to you. Thank you for watching.
So, shut up. Blah, blah, blah. Them and selfish genes reference is to different people. God dang, there's a whole bunch of crap. Wait, where is this stuff about I have a tabletop game launching soon. Excuse me. Where is the... Oh, there's Primer Blobs. Gotta love those guys. And Joe. Okay, what's this about tabletop game? The Pui launch. Why does it make me think of Cards Against Humanity, except for its science? Okay, cool. That's generally what it is. It's Cards Against Humanity, but it's science. Or it's like... It almost looks like Trivial Pursuit. Because it's got those, like... The fuck? Yeah, Trivial Pursuit or whatever else. It's like you got the questions and the answers are there. It's like, do you know this stuff? It's like that looks so incredibly nerdy that it's like it's not even D&D. It's not like it's not bad. It could be fun. Kids might like it. But whatever. Getting back to the video, I feel like the whole... What the Okay, I don't know why it won't size correctly. Whatever. This whole thing feels like... Obviously, it could... Like, again, I would prefer a video talking about the first organisms that exist before genetics, and then assuming that was how it happened, then you end up with that understanding and how they ended up making the genes. And it's weird that you have all of this sub-process that is, again, not the sentience that is you, but it is all the other components doing their part, making the liver, making the heart, and the everything, and blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, skin cells, freaking neurons, and junk. And it's like, what could be the thing that started it all? And it's like, I would much prefer or enjoy that video over this. This feels like it's a bit removed, and again, I feel like it ignores certain parts that it's where it's trying to explain something, but it's like the thing about things with that community and whatever else is, again, if you had them grow up in example captivity, it would take a few generations before they reactivate all of the different personality traits that would allow them to actually do the thing that allows them to survive out there, like Mustangs and everything else. They used to be really fast and stuff because they had to be fast to get away from other animals and survive. And now they're just fast because they're made to be fast from one guy who was fast. And it's like, wait, have we totally just screwed ourselves about horses? It's sad. I like horses. Too simplified, ironically. Like,